Welcome to the deep dive. You've given us a really rich source here, this historical account digging right into the French Revolution.
Yeah, it's quite something.
So think of this as our shared mission.
Yeah.
We're going to navigate this really wild, chaotic period through the eyes of this specific text. We'll try and pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, the vivid stuff this source highlights.
That's the plan. A deep dive into your source material to get a handle on those, well, tumultuous final years of the Ancien regime and then the explosion of the revolution itself.
Okay.
We'll focus on what this particular text thinks is important and why. Hopefully give you a clear picture without just drowning in historical detail.
Sounds good.
So
Let's jump in. Setting the scene, we're in France, late 1770s, 1780s. And according to your source, things are not looking good. It starts like painting this picture of decay,
Yeah.
even at the top.
Absolutely. The text gets right into it with figures like Duc d'Aiguillon. Years before things really kicked off, he's described as being, disgraced, accused of poltroonery and tyranny.
Right.
Standard stuff, maybe.
Oh.
But the source adds this specific charge: concussion.
Concussion? What did that mean back then? Not like a head injury, I assume.
No. The text explains. It's basically official plunder, extorting money through abuse of power, shaking people down, essentially. And what's really telling, according to the source, is that these pretty serious accusations, they weren't really answered. They were just quashed, pushed aside by, backstairs influence, connections.
So right away, the text is showing us a system that's kind of rotten, held together by favors and influence.
Exactly. And it stresses this is a fundamentally changed France compared to, say, Louis XIV, the Sun King, l'état c'est moi, the state. That's me.
Yeah, you can't imagine Louis VI saying that.
No. That era of just absolute, unquestioned power, clearly over. And Louis VI is a different kind of king in a different world.
And the source talks about the ideas floating around, too.
Oh, definitely. It captures this real clash. You've got Jean-Jacques Rousseau apparently foreseeing an age of revolutions approaches, but he adds, kind of hopefully, of happy blessed ones, maybe a bit naive.
Maybe just a bit.
And then there's philosophism, the Enlightenment ideals promising truth and Astrea redux, like a return to some mythical golden age of justice.
But the text isn't buying it, is it? It calls this age of hope questionable, uses this really powerful image. Society is an infinite abyss, overarched by habit.
That phrase, overarched by habit, that's key in the source's view. It suggests the old ways, the customs, the sheer routine. That's the only thing holding society together over this chaos.
Right.
Which raises a huge question the text seems to be wrestling with. What happens when that habit, that thin crust, finally breaks?
Exactly, because you've got these new ideas, liberalism pushing for change on one side, but on the other, the old guard, the Ile de Boeuf, that's the court at Versailles, they're still demanding what the source calls continued royal moneys.
And the source gives you the punchline right there. That demand for more money from an empty treasury is precisely the impossible one. It just can't happen. The system is financially, and you could argue morally, bankrupt.
The money's gone, but the demands aren't. Which I guess brings us to the attempts to fix things and the crisis getting worse.
Yes, the text moves right into the reformers. It highlights Turgot. He tries to clean the Augean stable, that Greek myth, the stable that hadn't been cleaned in forever. It's a metaphor for this huge, seemingly impossible task of sorting out France's finances.
And the source says he's honest, he gets it, but he lacks the Fortunatus's purse?
Right. Fortunatus had that magic puss that never ran out of money. So Turgot has the will, the brains maybe, but not the infinite cash needed to fix this bottomless pit of debt. It really shows the scale of the problem as the source sees it.
The text also brings up Beaumarchais the Figaro guy. It mentions his law pleadings, his public legal fights having a big impact, and it describes the Palais Royal under his influence in these wild terms: the sorcerers, Sabbath, and Satan at home of our planet.
That description is incredible, isn't it? The source paints the Palais Royal as just the absolute epicenter of all the buzz, the rumor, the plotting. Maybe chaotic, even a bit sinister from the source's perspective, but undeniably central.
It shows how these public spaces, public arguments, were becoming engines for change. But what's interesting, the source points out contradictions too, right? Even among reformers.
Yeah, it uses the example of the friend of men that was Mirabeau's father, known as an Enlightenment thinker.
Yeah.
But the source points out this same guy privately needed 60 lettres de cachet.
60, those royal arrest warrants for his own family.
Exactly. Arbitrary imprisonment orders. The source includes that detail to really highlight this gap, often hypocritical, between lofty ideas and, well, personal actions, or just using the old tools of power when it's suited.
Meanwhile, the money situation just gets worse. Monsieur de Calonne tries his luck. The source says he attempts an Aaron's rod, like a magic trick to fix things.
Right, like turning a staff into a snake. But instead of a miracle, it just leads to this bitter, angry correspondence with Necker, the guy before him. Blame game, basically.
So Calonne calls the Assembly of Notables. What was the plan there?
Well, the source suggests the plan was for them to just approve new taxes, but they refused. Instead, they went home and spread the word about the deficit, decrepitude, distraction. They basically confirmed how bad things were, making the idea of calling the States General seem necessary, but also really, really risky.
And getting any new money meant getting fiscal edicts registered by the Parliament of Paris. That wasn't just paperwork, was it?
Oh, exactly. It was a form of approval, a legal hurdle. And the Parliament of Paris, these high courts, mostly hereditary judges, they dug their heels in. They refused.
So what could the king do?
The traditional royal move was a bed of justice. The king goes to the parliament in person, usually out at Versailles, and basically orders them to register the edict. They could protest, but ultimately they had to obey.
But the source says this time was different.
Very different. It describes the conflict escalating into an internecine duel, like a fight to the death within the system. Crowds gathered, supporting the parliament, including, the source notes, young, rich, eleutheromaniac noblemen.
Eleutheromaniac!
Yeah, nobles obsessed with liberty, conspicuously dressed in English style, apparently, plus other people, all backing the parliament against the king.
So public opinion is really shifting.
That's a key point the text emphasizes, and it uses a really tragic story to show how justice was being twisted. The case of Lally.
Dolly.
A brave soldier, apparently, executed despite his valor. Described as being driven mad like the snared lion, even gagged with wood at his execution so he couldn't speak. The source uses this as a stark example of the cruelty and injustice of the time.
Grim. And the text mentions the Queen, Marie Antoinette.
Yeah, briefly but pointedly. Describes her difficult position, surrounded by confusion and black care. And it throws in a mention of the Lamothe necklace affair, that old scandal implying it still hung over her, adding to the suspicion, making things even harder for the monarchy.
So all these pressures, money, ideas, unrest, the courts resisting the source, shows how they all push towards one thing.
The States General. Summoning this ancient assembly, which hadn't met in, 170 years, starts to seem like the only option left.
So the decision's made, summon the States General. The text describes the process. Local assemblies, electing deputies.
And crucially, compiling lists of grievances, the cahier of doléances, every region, every group listing what was wrong.
And the source mentions Dr. Guillotin here. Yes, that Guillotin.
Fascinating detail. The text says he drew up his own plan of a cahier of doléances. He was trying to get signatures for it, and the Parliament of Paris actually summoned him, tried to shut him down.
How did that go for them?
It's not well. The source says he showed up, but with all Paris at his heels. The crowd was so behind him, they signed his cahier right there, in the courtyards outside the Parliament.
Wow.
It's a small moment, maybe, but the source uses it to show that popular opinion, the voice of Paris, was already a force that could challenge the old authorities.
A real sign of the times. So this whole process leads to the election of how many deputies?
1,214, the text notes. A huge number.
Which brings us to the big opening, May 1789. The source describes a gala at Versailles and this formal procession of all the deputies.
Right. Clergy, nobles, Third Estate, everyone processing together.
But the source sees this as more than just pomp and circumstance.
Oh, much more. The author interprets it as pronouncing sentence of death on shams, a declaration that a lie is unbelievable. It frames this moment, this gathering, as the end of pretending, the moment truth, however messy, starts to break through.
And the text paints pictures of the key players arriving.
Vividly. Mirabeau gets a big description, a world compeller. The source details his shaggy beetle brows and rough-hewn, seamed, carbuncled face. It lists everything. Natural ugliness, smallpox, incontinence, bankruptcy, and burning fire of genius. Really emphasizes his raw power, his flaws, his contradictions.
He's quite the description. Who else?
We see figures like Mounier and Malouet experienced, but maybe, the text hints, a bit too cautious for what's coming. Pétion, with his placid, unalterable self-belief. Rabot Saint-Étienne, a Protestant pastor. And Abbé Sieyès, the source, credits him as unique, someone who actually had a theory of the world.
So a real mix of personalities and ideas converging.
Definitely. And it's the third estate, basically. Everyone else who wasn't clergy or nobility who quickly make their move, they declare they represent the nation and rename themselves the National Assembly.
And that leads to a famous showdown with the king's master of ceremonies.
Yes, the supreme usher, the brise. He comes into their hall with a royal command, probably telling them to disperse or meet separately.
And Mirabeau steps up.
Delivers that legendary reply. The source doesn't quote the most famous version right then, but refers to his defiance later. The key thing the text emphasizes is the reaction. The galleries, the public watching, they applauded him wildly. It was a public win for the assembly, backed by the people.
How did the court react, the Ile de Boeuf?
Thrown into chaos, according to the source. Confusion reigns. They decide the king needs to hold a royal session, lay down the law, reassert his authority.
But things go wrong even before that session.
Yeah, the text captures this real sense of insult felt by the Third Estate deputies. They show up for the session, find their hall locked, guards posted, and they're left waiting outside in the rain.
Not good.
Leads to the famous tennis court oath, of course, though the source focuses more on the slight being wetted waiting under mean porches as the trigger for their defiance.
So at the royal session itself, June 23rd, the king gives some ground but insists the orders vote separately, trying to keep the old ways.
Pretty much. But the Third Estate refuses to back down.
And Mirabeau speaks again.
Here the source does quote him, or a version of it. "We are here by will of the people, and we will not leave, save by the force of bayonets." Big stuff. And eventually, the king caves, tells the other orders to join the National Assembly. The source presents this as a clear turning point, a victory for the Third Estate.
But while the assembly is winning political battles, things are heating up in Paris.
Oh, definitely. The source describes the temperature rising fast, agitation, rumors flying, fueled by places like the Palais Royal, and crucially, troop movements. People see soldiers gathering.
And then a specific incident makes things explode.
General Besenval's troops are there, and one officer, Lambesque, makes a disastrous move. He orders a cavalry charge in the Tuileries Garden, a public park.
Charging civilians.
Yes. And the source uses this incredibly dramatic language. It says this act wakes frenzy and the three furies. It's the spark that ignites the Parisian powder keg.
And a big part of this explosion is the army itself becoming unreliable. The Garde Française.
Crucial point the text makes. The French guards, the king's own troops in Paris, they become questionable. They're not willing to fire on the Parisians.
And there's an incident that proves this.
Yes, the source highlights when 11 Garde Française ringleaders, guys who sided with the people, get locked up in the Abbé prison. What happens? The Paris crowd storms the prison and frees them.
Wow.
It shows two things, right? The army can't be counted on by the king, and the people of Paris are armed, organized enough, and willing to act directly.
So the popular uprising just escalates. People grabbing weapons.
Armor shops broken into, looted. Paris goes rabid, the source says, dancing with the fiend for Piper. Just pure chaos and fury unleashed on the streets.
Which leads, just a few days later, to July 14th. The Hôtel des Invalides first.
Right. The text mentions the attack there. It confusingly calls it Saint Lazarus too, maybe metaphorically. But it's the Invalides, the military hospital and arsenal. They go there for more weapons. It gets plundered, partly burned.
The Garde Française?
They defect fully. Bring cannons with them. So now the armed crowd, plus defecting soldiers with artillery, heads for the Bastille.
The symbol of royal power.
Exactly. The ancient fortress, the prison. The source gives this vivid account of the siege, the fighting, the fall of the Bastille. Commandant Delaunay, the governor, is overwhelmed. The source notes he tried to kill himself with his cane sword. Failed. And was killed by the mob.
Brutal.
And it gives this specific image. Elie, one of the leaders of the attack, marching with the signed surrender paper stuck on the point of his sword.
The fall of the Bastille.
Yeah.
The source presents it as this huge symbolic moment, tearing down despotism.
Absolutely. A physical and psychological blow to the old regime. So, with the Bastille down, the National Assembly is still meeting, trying to build new France.
How does the source describe their debates?
With a bit of skepticism, maybe? Calls them a Sanhedrin of pedants? Like an ancient council, maybe a bit out of touch, talking a lot. Not gerund grinding, it says not totally pointless academic stuff, but still ultimately unproductive. Spinning ropes of sand.
Spinning ropes of sand. That's a fantastic image. What's the source getting at?
It suggests the assembly, for all its ideals, is struggling to create anything solid, anything lasting. They're good at cutting asunder ancient, intolerable bonds, breaking the old system. But when it comes to building new ones, all they can manage is something as fragile and useless as ropes made of sand.
So they're debating big ideas.
Oh, yeah. Rights of man, right of peace and war, the king's veto suspensive, absent, big abstract stuff. Mirabeau is still there, this complex figure. Abbé Marie is mentioned as a key opponent of the changes, and the source notes the growing visibility of the sans-culotte.
The without breeches crowd. Ordinary working people.
Initially associated, the source says, with just passionate patriotism, but their presence is growing.
Which it kind of raises the question, from the source's viewpoint, who's actually in charge now? The king's in Paris, but seems like a prisoner. Rumors swirling about plots to get him out, his authority just draining away.
And this leads to what the source calls a really fatal business decided by the Assembly, the civil constitution of the clergy.
Fatal. Why does the source see it as so disastrous?
Because, as the text explains, this measure basically nationalized the church. It made clergy state employees, required them to swear an oath to the new state, and this just split France right down the middle.
How so?
Into jurant priests, those who took the oath, and dissident or refractory priests who refused, seeing it as interfering with religion. The text mentions violence, like the fustigation whipping basically of priests who refused the oath. It created this deep, bitter religious divide across the country that the source clearly thinks was a huge mistake.
This religious split, plus the king being basically trapped, that sets the stage for his escape attempt.
Seems like it. First, there's a failed attempt to go to St. Cloud, just outside Paris, supposedly for Easter, but the crowds and Lafayette's National Guard stop him.
A dry run, almost.
The source presents it that way, yeah. A precursor to the big one. The flight to Varennes in June 1791. The text gives dramatic details. Count Fersen helping plan it, the huge, obvious royal coach, the Berline, the delays. Even mentions a delay caused by a broken shoe buckle, taking a wrong turn leaving Paris. It all seems doomed from the start.
And the journey itself.
Painfully slow, the source emphasizes. 69 miles in 22 incessant hours. That slowness, the king's bad disguise, plus troops waiting for him along the route, which just made people suspicious. Disaster waiting to happen.
And the source includes that famous detail about how he was recognized.
Yeah, by Drouet, the postmaster at Saint-Menehould. Supposedly recognized the king's face from his picture on an assignat, the new paper money.
Incredible.
Drouet rides like mad through the night to the next town to run and raises the alarm.
And that's where they're caught.
The text describes the arrest. The slow, humiliating journey back to Paris. Surrounded by guards, silent crowds watching, a king caught trying to flee his own kingdom.
What does the source say about the impact of this? On Lafayette, for instance.
His influence collapses, the source notes. He was supposed to be guarding the king. But the bigger impact, it completely destroyed any lingering trust in the king. He was no longer seen as a willing partner in the revolution, but as someone who tried to betray it. A massive turning point.
So after Varennes, the first assembly ends, but things don't exactly calm down. More instability, rising radicalism. The source mentions the massacre of the Champ de Mars.
Right, July 1791. After the king's failed flight, radicals were demanding his removal, a republic. A crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars in Paris to sign a petition. Lafayette's National Guard fired on them.
The guard firing on the people.
Yeah. The force presents it as this moment where the authorities, trying to keep order, turned violently against the popular movement that had started the revolution. A really bloody sign of the growing divisions.
And the king's return to Paris after Varennes.
Starkly described by the source as his second royal progress and entrance into Paris. But this time, clearly, as a figure with no real power left. Just a figurehead, or less.
A new assembly is elected, the Legislative Assembly, but the turmoil continues.
Oh yeah. Intensifies even. The source points to threats from outside. The emigrants, the nobles who fled, gathering at Koblenz on the German border, shouting on, wanting foreign armies to invade, supported by the Austrian Kaiser.
And inside France, still trouble.
Definitely. The excommunicatory priests, the ones who refuse the oath, are causing unrest. Grumbling in places like La Vendée. The text mentions this almost mythical counter-revolutionary hotspot in the south, a real imaginary camp of the fiend at Yelles.
Real imaginary. What's that suggest?
Curious phrase, isn't it? The source seems to mean there was a real center of counter-revolution there, but maybe its threat, its nature, got exaggerated in the minds of the revolutionaries, blown up into something almost demonic. Shows how fear and rumor were huge factors.
So the Legislative Assembly tries to act, sets up a court.
A high court at Orléans for political crimes, yeah. But the king keeps using his veto power, blocking laws against the non-juring priests, against the emigrants. frustrating the assembly.
Which just highlights the deadlock.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes that while the king technically has this power, the real power is shifting. Wait, to the Jacobin clubs, especially in Paris. They're becoming the center of gravity.
And the source names key figures emerging in Paris.
It does. Pétion is mayor of Paris now. Danton, whose voice the text describes dramatically as reverberating from the domes. Manuel, Bilot-Varennes, Tallien, plus guys like Brissot, Desmoulins. It's showing us this shift. Power moving from formal bodies to these radical clubs in the Paris Commune, driven by these often fiery personalities.
And this radical pressure, plus the king's vetoes, the source presents this as leading directly to the next big explosion.
August 10th, 1792. The insurrection. The text describes the rising tension, the calls to deal with traitors, meaning the monarchy.
So what happens on the day?
The Paris radicals, the Commune, sympathetic National Guards. They attack the Tuileries Palace, where the king is living. The source gives a vivid account of the fighting, especially the massacre of the Swiss guards defending the palace. Known for their loyalty, cut down.
And the king and family.
They flee the palace during the attack. Seek refuge first in the assembly building nearby, but ultimately they end up imprisoned. In the temple fortress, the source uses this image of its towers like a peaked extinguisher or bonsoir, like putting out the light of the monarchy for good.
So, August 10th, according to the source, that's it for the king.
The decisive end of royalty in France, yes. It also notes Lafayette makes his final exit here, tries to rally troops against the Paris radicals, fails and has to flee the country.
What's striking is the panic that follows this in Paris. The source links it to news from the war front.
Directly. News arrives that the Prussian army has captured Verdun, a key fortress. Suddenly, Paris feels exposed, vulnerable. This sparks this intense fear of enemies within the city. Counter-revolutionaries, prisoners, plotting, leads straight into the September Massacres.
Horrifying. Starting September 2nd.
Yeah. The source describes the toxin, the alarm bells ringing constantly, mobs forming, heading for the prisons.
And inside the prisons.
The text paints this grim picture. Summary justice, or rather, vengeance. It describes a strange court of justice, or call it court of revenge and wild justice, set up in the Abbé prison, presided over by Stanislas Maillard, who was also prominent at the Bastille. Similar scenes at La Force, the Châtelet, the Conciergerie, just mass killings.
The source mentions specific victims.
It recounts the fate of the Princess de Lamballe, the queen's friend, killed, her head paraded on a pike. The text doesn't shy away from the sheer brutality of it.
But it also mentions attempts to justify this, a circular.
Yeah, signed by figures including Marat. It tries to explain the massacres as essentially a necessary evil, a preemptive strike, claiming the prisoners were about to break out and butcher our wives and children. It shows how fear and paranoia were used to legitimize, or at least explain, even this horrific violence, according to the source's account.
And amidst all this, a new government body is elected.
The National Convention. Elected in a decisive spirit, the source says, and one of its very first acts. Declare the first year of the Republic. France is officially a republic.
And the convention has its own key players.
A lot of the prominent Jacobins now have national power. Robespierre, Danton again, Pétion, Barbaroux, Rebecca, Carrier, Le Bon. It's the next phase, with a new, more radical leadership taking center stage.
And almost at the exact same time the Republic is declared, there's a battle. Valmy.
Remarkable timing, isn't it? September 20, 1792. The French Revolutionary Army under Kellerman and Dumouriez faces the invading Prussians led by the Duke of Brunswick. The source notes it wasn't maybe a huge tactical victory, but the Prussians retreated. The French soldiers shouted, "Vive la République!" a sound the source says was born dubious on the winds.
Dubious?
Maybe suggesting the future of this new republic was still very uncertain, fragile, despite the victory cry.
But it was a turning point, gave the Republic breathing room. But the convention had an immediate, huge question to deal with.
The biggest question, what shall be done with King Louis?
How does the source present the arguments?
It focuses on the case for execution. Highlights Robespierre, arguing that in a revolution, traditional law might have to bend to necessity. Right was might, in a sense. And Saint-Just, cold logic. The king must die for the republic to live.
And the vote?
For death. The force notes, a majority of 2-1 answers that there shall be no appeal.
And the execution itself, January 21st, 1793, how does the source frame its impact?
As profoundly divisive. Inside France, it divided all friends, polarized the revolutionaries themselves, and outside France, it united all enemies, solidified the coalition of European monarchies against the revolution. a point of no return, really.
And this execution really does seem to fuel everything. Civil war, foreign war.
Intensifies it all, yeah. The source mentions the fighting in La Vendée in Lyon, and the war against Europe ramps up.
And conflict within the convention, too, between factions.
Absolutely. The Mountain the Radicals, based in Paris, versus the Gironde faction. Seen as more moderate, perhaps more representing the provinces. The force describes the Girondins struggling to control Paris, trying to counter the power of the extreme sections.
Which leads to another purge.
Yes, the insurrection of May 31st, June 2nd, 1793. Driven by the Paris radicals, the Mountain. The demand, the source says, was that the convention commissioners must be dealt with, meaning the Girondin leaders who were seen as obstacles.
And they were dealt with.
Arrested, expelled from the convention. The source later grimly notes the fate of some who escaped, like Buzot and Pétion, found dead in a field, partially eaten by dogs. A brutal end for that faction, as the source tells it.
So with the Girondins gone, the reign of terror really gets going.
That's how the source chronicles it. The Revolutionary Tribunal is set up a swift tribunal for traitors, meaning quick trials, often little defense, leading straight to the guillotine. The National Razor, now working daily. The source uses that chilling image. Like a black specter daily at eventide, glides the death tumbrel. The cart taking victims to execution, a daily ghost.
And amidst this, the source recounts Marat's assassination.
By Charlotte Corday, yeah, July 1793. The source notes her calmness before her own execution, and the extreme reaction it provoked, like Adam Lux, who basically worshipped her act and demanded to die the same way, which he did.
The terror wasn't just in Paris, though. The source talks about the provinces.
Oh, yes. Chillingly. Describes the brutal repression in cities that resisted, like Lyon, bombarding Lyons day and night, famine, mass execution, systematic destruction.
And Carrier at Nantes.
The source details his atrocities, especially the noyades, the mass drownings in the River Loire. It includes the horrifying revolutionary slang for it. Marriage Republican, Republican marriage, sometimes tying a man and woman together before drowning them. Carrier's quoted justifying it. Quel torrent révolutionnaire. What a revolutionary torrent, justifying mass murder as revolutionary necessity. The source really doesn't hold back on the horror. It also mentions the attempts to de-Christianize France, the cult of reason adored in weird ceremonies, trying to replace the old faith.
That the revolution starts turning on itself, purges within the ruling group.
Exactly. The source shows the terror consuming its own creators. First, the Hébertists, ultra-radicals, maybe too anarchic, are purged and executed. Then Danton and his followers, the Dantonists, seen as becoming too moderate, maybe corrupt, possibly wanting to slow the terror. They go to the guillotine, too. Nobody is safe.
Which sets things up for the fall of the biggest figure of the terror.
Robespierre.
What's the atmosphere like then, according to the source?
Thick with paranoia, utter suspicion. Faces of men are darkened with suspicion, with suspecting or being suspect. Everyone watching everyone else, afraid of being the next target. The source mentions a couple of things that might have weakened him. The weird feast of the supreme being he orchestrated.
Yeah, this sort of deist civic religion, and the bizarre Catherine Theo affair. An old mystic woman proclaimed him or was linked to him somehow, made him look maybe ridiculous or dangerously messianic to some.
And then it all comes crashing down. 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794.
How does the source describe that day in the convention?
As total chaos, a bedlam storm. Deputies finally shouting him down, turning on him and his close allies. Robespierre, usually the master orator, tries to speak but can't. The source says his frothing lips are grown blue. He's silenced, arrested.
And the end?
Swift. The next day, Robespierre, Saint-Just, his key allies, guillotined, executed by the very system they had dominated.
And the immediate result, according to the source?
A collective sigh of relief, almost. A desire to finish the terror. It wasn't necessarily everyone's plan who opposed Robespierre, but that was the effect. The daily executions stopped. The source calls this period the death agony of Sansculottism, the radical popular movement losing its power, moderatism rising again like a rushing of a mighty organ blast.
And Parisian life changes. The source contrasts the new mood.
Vividly. It mentions figures like La Cabarrus, Madame Tallien becoming fashion icons, the rise of the Muscadins, these flamboyant anti-Jacobin young men replacing the grim tabadadors, the tough guys of the terror, a huge cultural shift. Although the source adds famine and bread queues, they continued for ordinary people. But there's some accountability. for the terror's excesses. Some figures like Carrier, the butcher of Nantes, are tried and executed, a sign that the worst offenders might face justice, though it was selective.
The convention itself is stumbling towards its end now, still facing challenges.
Yeah, its final phase is messy, divided internally, and there are last-gasp attempts by the remaining Sansculottes to regain power. The source calls it the lion sprawling its last. Describes the Prairial Uprising, May 1795. Crowds invade the convention hall again, demanding bread and the Constitution of '93.
That radical constitution that was never implemented?
Exactly. They were fighting for that more radical vision, but they fail.
How are these final uprisings put down?
By the military. Decisively. The source gives a pointed mention here. Citoyen Bonaparte. Citizen Bonaparte. Napoleon using cannon fire, the famous whiff of grape shot, to crush the Vendémiaire uprising in October 1795. So the army steps in to settle political scores in Paris, pretty much. The source presents this as the end of popular insurrection as a viable political tool, at least for a while. The sacred right of insurrection is gone forever, it declares, perhaps a bit prematurely.
And then the convention finally dissolves, a new constitution.
Yes, the Sieyès Constitution is implemented, setting up the Directory government. And the convention ends. The source uses this final image. The miraculous convention ship has got to land. Miraculous, maybe, but what a journey, eh? According to your source. Just an incredibly intense, fast, brutal period of transformation.
Absolutely. This deep dive, just following your source material, has really walked us through those first incredibly turbulent years, from the crumbling old regime right to the end of the convention.
And the text you gave us uses such strong imagery. The revolution as a sea of fire consuming the old world. It also leaves us pondering that idea that no lie can live forever, suggesting truth emerges eventually, even if that truth keeps changing its vesture, its clothes, its appearance.
Maybe the thought to leave you with, reflecting on this material, is just that. How much do those habits, those perceived lies or unquestioned assumptions hold society together? What really happens when they shatter? And how does that violent struggle for a new truth, a new order, end up creating its own often terrifying realities and contradictions?
A lot to think about, for sure. We hope this deep dive, sticking closely to your sources, has shed some light on this period, maybe giving you some compelling insights straight from the text itself. Definitely keep exploring.